Hi everybody, welcome to this episode of the Conscious Grief series. Today I am joined by Lotte Bowser, who is a young widow and a writer and a yoga teacher, and I am so honoured to have her here. We only just met a couple of weeks ago in Mexico, and at last minute you have very kindly said that you would make time to do this interview, so thank you very much for being here, Lotte.
Thank you for having me, Tara. It's honestly my honour. I'm really happy to be a part of this.
Thank you. And I immediately recognized you when I saw you because I have been following you on Instagram because your dear beloved Ben died, and you have been an amazing advocate for your grief and really honoring him in your Instagram posts. And I just think you've created something so meaningful, so helpful, so inspiring for other people. So we often complain about social media, but I really think grief is one place where it helps so many people. So perhaps you could tell us how that came about and how it's supported you in your grief.
Absolutely. So my fiance Ben was diagnosed with an MPNST tumour, which is a subtype of soft tissue sarcoma, in July 2019. And he was very open and vocal about his diagnosis and his journey with his illness from the start. And his story gained quite a lot of traction. And after his terminal diagnosis in March 2020, we were looking at alternative treatment options outside of the NHS, which were incredibly expensive. So we started a fundraiser, and the story sort of grew more and more public. And I found that speaking about my experience as Ben's partner and as his caregiver to be incredibly cathartic in that time. And this was at the height of the pandemic. So Ben was diagnosed with the terminal diagnosis 2 weeks after the national lockdown was announced in mid-March. And so social media became an essential outlet for me to connect with others and to feel less alienated and alone in my experience. And 8 months after Ben's terminal diagnosis, he ended up in ICU with COVID-19 disease. And at that point, we required further funding for his treatment that was keeping him alive whilst he was on the ventilator. And the story just became bigger and bigger. And obviously at that point, it was incredibly relevant. Hundreds and thousands of people have been impacted by this virus. And so I think the story really connected with a lot of people. And because I was navigating that experience, and then the grief after he passed in isolation still, as the lockdowns were ongoing, it was just such a crucial lifeline for me to connect with others, to feel as though I wasn't alone, to have this community, not in the physical sense, but at least, online. And I've inadvertently, off the back of sharing my experience, become an advocate for grief awareness and literacy within the community.
You certainly have. I feel that, like, you're an educator through your Instagram, and so many people are connecting with you and resonating, and also you've created many amazing friendships from that account too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I quickly realized that I couldn't survive this alone. And this was unprecedented in my community at home. Nobody my age had been through a trauma or a loss like this. So I suddenly found myself feeling incredibly alienated amongst my closest friends and my wider friendship group as well. And I desperately needed to speak to and connect with people that understood what I was going through. And I would find myself in the early hours of the morning, unable to sleep because of the pain of my loss, searching through hashtags on Instagram, looking for grief-focused accounts, and then looking through the comments and finding people that were also navigating partner loss. And then I would send them unsolicited messages and just say, hi, I'm going through something similar. If you ever wanted to talk, I think it would be really beneficial for the both of us. I'm here and I understand what you're going through. And fast forward 15 months later, I find myself surrounded by, again, not in the physical, literal sense, but in this online space, the most incredible men and women, all of whom have navigated partner loss, whether it be deaths resulting from cancer or tragically suicide or freak accidents, whatever it might be. And there has been an unparalleled sense of solidarity and strength within those connections. So I feel very fortunate for Instagram, for social media, for all of its downfalls. It can be the most incredible tool.
Absolutely. And I remember you saying, Instagram saved my life. And it just, I think what you're sharing here just really emulates the person that you are, that you took this action to reach out to people and connect and find other people that were going through something similar to create your own community, which just shows how much tenacity you have as a person. So
thank you. I appreciate that. I think the tragic, devastating, most difficult to come to terms with fact about death is that nothing can be done to bring your person back. And so you have to find a way to integrate and to carry the pain of your loss and your grief, because otherwise it will destroy you. And it does, in many respects. I know that you have experienced this personally. I certainly have. There were moments where I didn't want to be here and where I didn't feel as though I could go on, but I knew that I had to find a way. And as much as I had an incredible support system around me, this is unprecedented for everyone. No one knows what to do or say. They can only be there to the best of their ability. So I quickly realized that it's as much my responsibility as it is anybody else's to help myself in this experience.
And it's also just really amazing because you're carrying Ben forward and him as a person and his memory. So through your account, we get to know Ben and we get to really love Ben. I love the hashtags people put, be like Ben.
Be more Ben.
Yeah.
That's it. And I have my own spiritual beliefs that have brought me a lot of comfort in the midst of this loss. But I really feel that one way we can move forwards with our grief, without our person in the physical sense, is realizing that while their life might have ended, the relationship hasn't. And you get to reframe that now. You get to decide how you carry that forwards. And you absolutely can. That person is still very much around. Energy cannot be destroyed. Right. So their energy and their spirit, my friend Jess describes it as an energetic afterglow. It's still very much alive and present. And to be able to share Ben's magic and to celebrate him with the world and have people get to know him through what I've shared is such a wonderful feeling. It's brought me so much comfort.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you realize that so so early on. And
Mm.
I think that many people are starting to realize the sort of importance of mourning in that way of keeping their memory alive and finding ways to bring them into their daily lives or on anniversaries, birthdays, things like that, that we don't have to. In the past, I think people tended to feel like it had to be a very private affair, and just we don't talk about it, we don't know what to do.
Mm.
We
Mm.
sort of forgot those people, and it's so sad to think that.
It's really sad, because that person, those people mattered, and they still matter. As I said, death ends a life, it doesn't end a relationship. You can't just suddenly turn off, you know, a lifetime of you know, this connection and this love that you have for that person or those people. We talk about our experience and we talk about our people. The more we normalize it, and the more comfort we feel.
Definitely.
Mm.
100%.
Mm.
And that we can, like you say, keep that relationship going, because the love doesn't die, and we need to, you know, keep the love, keep our hearts open, keep the love flowing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's that quote that says, grief is love with nowhere to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, channeling that love into celebrating Ben, making sure that I acknowledge and do something on the special occasions, that I celebrate his birthdays, is a way of expressing that love. You know, it's not the first choice, it's not the way that I want to express it, but at least there is an outlet of some kind.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Mm.
Now, shifting gears slightly, as you shared, you have been going through all of this in the midst of a global pandemic. So you had to deal with all the social distancing, all the difficulties, and then more recently, we've just had it revealed that our government wasn't following the rules which you had to follow. So maybe, how has that been for you? Is there any way you've managed to, as you talked about, reframing your grief? Have you been able to reconcile this? How's it left you feeling?
Mm. You know, Tara, in some respects, after Ben passed, to have had that time in isolation, I think it might have served me well to some degree, because I was forced to face my grief day in, day out.
Mm.
I didn't have any distractions around me.
Mm.
And in a way, I think that has helped me to integrate it perhaps a little bit quicker.
Right.
Although there isn't a set timeline, you know, we know that grief does not follow a linear trajectory, and it's a lifelong process of integration. I do think that it helped me to integrate and to move through some stuff, you know, a bit faster. Mm-hmm. But overall, the experience was utterly horrific, as you can imagine. When somebody receives a cancer diagnosis, it takes a village. It takes a village to support that person. They are deserving of that village. Yeah. But because Ben was considered extremely vulnerable, since the metastases were in his lungs and in his chest, we were left with no choice but to navigate it, just the two of us. So all of the responsibility fell on me to take care of him. And it was incredibly difficult. And the recent allegations, or the revelations, the government's breach of those rules, brought a lot of stuff back to the surface again. Mm-hmm. I had to relive that experience, you know, those 8 months of navigating Ben's terminal diagnosis throughout the pandemic. It was incredibly triggering for me, as I'm sure it was millions of others.
Mm-hmm.
But what's done is done, right? And one thing that I learned very early on in my grief is that when you're in so much pain as it is, you have to find a way to mitigate as much suffering as you can.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing that a lot of people experiencing grief have to deal with is the pain of hindsight, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all of the other stuff surrounding that person's passing, the what ifs, the various scenarios that could have played out that might have meant the outcome was different, things like that. But ultimately, what's done is done, right? It is what it is. Nothing can be done to change what's happened. So I think in that respect, I have reconciled things, and I don't feel so tormented by and consumed by, those things that are now in the past.
Yeah, well, I hear a lot of wisdom from what you're sharing, because it's not as not easy to hear all of those things. And I was wondering, for you personally in your grief journey, have you experienced much anger? And if you have, do you have a way of processing or releasing your anger?
Definitely a lot of anger, and rightfully so. I think something that tormented me in the very early days, soon after Ben had passed, was the idea that things might have been different had his diagnosis not have come about in the midst of the pandemic, and cancer services were greatly impacted by, the strain of COVID cases on the NHS at large. And just the various decisions that were made, could things have been done differently? That would have meant Ben was still here today.
Mm-hmm.
As far as finding ways to channel that goes, I started working with a grief integration specialist who is particularly well versed in trauma. Her partner passed from cancer 4 or 5 years ago, and so she holds space for all of that stuff. And so talking therapy has been incredibly helpful for me. But there are things that just cannot be shifted verbally, right? It's such a visceral experience, grief. Not everything can be communicated or integrated verbally. So I have found body-based practices to be incredibly beneficial for moving some of that like physical aggression and anger and trauma out of my body.
Mm-hmm.
Things like yoga, dancing, and high intensity exercise as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it took me a while to get there because I was so debilitated physically at the start, and that's something that we can come back to shortly. It took me a while to summon the energy to do those, more physical practices.
Yeah, like you say, because grief is exhausting, isn't it? And it depletes.
So exhausting.
Yeah.
It's it's a mind, body, soul experience. It's not just emotional, mental, intellectual. It affects every part of your being.
Yeah.
And in a society that tells us, that we have to be operating constantly at 150 miles an hour, our society is very geared around productivity and achievement and success. There's almost that sense of, I feel sometimes we bypass our experience. We feel as though we need to be operating at a more acceptable pace, that we need to be moving through things much quicker. you know, getting back to normal, getting back to work, reintegrating into society. And it's just not possible, you know, it's not possible.
Yeah, it really isn't. And I think it was very interesting what you were sharing about the pandemic actually giving you that time to really confront your grief and really, really feel it. And that's
stop.
Yeah, and stop. And I know also that you are a yoga teacher. So I was interested, like, how you felt that yoga, if it has supported you, and as you sort of touched on a bit about how grief has impacted your own body.
Certainly. I think the last 10 years of studying and practicing and teaching yoga definitely stood me in good stead to navigate the enormity of this loss and the experience of grief to a certain degree. I'm very grateful to have had that practice and to have been walking what I consider to be a spiritual path for a number of years prior to Ben's diagnosis and passing. It's interesting because when people ask me if I still practice yoga, I say to them that life has felt like one continual yoga practice for the last 3 years. And that yoga isn't just confined to the four corners of our mat. It's so much more than asana. You know, it's the meditation, the mindfulness, the awareness of self and your experience. So I feel incredibly grateful to have had those tools, because I do think that they have enabled me to reach this point 15 months later after Ben's passing, where I can confidently say that I'm in a good place. But circling back to the second part of your question, how has it affected my body? I think having gone through 16 months of sustained trauma, so there was 16 months between Ben's first diagnosis to his death, having gone through that and feeling as though every day was a fight to keep my head above water and to keep my loved one alive, there was no time to rest and take stock and to fill my cup back up. So it was like a culmination of so much trauma and stress that immediately after he died, I felt completely and utterly physically obliterated. And I basically spent 3 to 4 months incapacitated in bed, slowly but surely, day by day, beginning to reintroduce self-care practices, getting myself up, having that shower, making a healthy meal, going out for a walk, and then eventually getting back on my yoga mat, doing some gentle stretching, which then led to, you know, the slightly more high intensity practices, which are now a staple. You know, they are an essential part of my weekly routine.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing about that early stage in those 3 months. And I wonder if anyone who's listening to this who is in their really early stages, is there anything that you would like to say to those people? And so
much. My heart just goes out to each and every one of you. It's just the most, I find that loss is an unparalleled human experience. There is nothing as debilitating or as painful as losing a loved one. And now is the time to practice radical self-love and self-care, because there are no rules and you cannot get your grief wrong. You make up the rules. You get to decide what this looks like and what it is that you need. And so take rest, scream, cry, let it out, because it's healthy to express your emotions. Suppressing them, I feel, will only lead to more challenges down the line.
Yeah.
That's my opinion. And find the people that are safe containers for that. And recognize that this will take time. You know, it's a lifelong process, as you know, as I know. It is a lifelong process, but it does ebb and shift and change. And I'm so glad, Tara, that I held on in those early days, in those moments where I would wake up feeling so black that I wanted to end my own life. But I held on because I believed that surely when you've reached rock bottom, the only way is up, right? It cannot get any worse than this.
Yeah.
So hold on, because with the passing of time comes the inevitability of the softening of the initial intensity. And I think those of us who have experienced loss are in a place to say this, and I say it with so much love and respect for everybody's journey, but it does get a little easier.
Yeah.
As time passes, you know, we get better at carrying the pain of our loss.
Yes, yes, that's a beautiful way of putting it. And you talked about finding the right people, you know, to surround yourself with, and holding the space. And I've seen on your Instagram, you've done some really great posts of the more unhelpful things that people say.
Yeah.
I just also wondered, now you're like a little further along, and if, or even, you know, pre that, if people have turned to you and said something unhelpful, have you pulled them up on it in the moment? And if so, how have you sort of maintained a boundary for yourself? Or do you just tend to ignore the comment?
Well, I think context is really important. And I suppose you have to take it case by case, yes. Conversation by conversation, person by person. Loss is uncharted for so many people, particularly at a young age. You know, we don't expect things like this to happen until perhaps you're a little bit older. But even then, society is so ill-equipped at supporting people in grief, because it's something that by and large remains unspoken about. You know, we are a very death avoidant, grief avoidant culture. So it's difficult no matter how old you are, you know. But for me, within my friendship groups, or at least within my close circle of friends, I felt comfortable enough to be able to assert my boundaries and to communicate when something wasn't supportive. And I think when you acknowledge the fact that you're all in it together, you know, my friends were also grieving the loss of Ben and wanting to support me in my grief. It's a learning curve for everyone, and people are bound to to slip up from time to time, but the intentions are always good, you know, but people will only learn if you tell them. And so I think it's really important. And having experienced a lot of these, you know, unhelpful platitudes and flyaway comments myself, I felt it was important to highlight those, you know, for my community who was perhaps on the receiving end of similar things. And yeah, you just have to, you know, you are deserving of setting those boundaries and pulling people up. But I think, you know, as I said before, it is uncharted, it is unparalleled. So many people don't know what to say because we just don't talk about it enough. We're very ill-equipped, you know, in general. So we can only get better if we have these conversations, albeit very difficult at the time.
Yeah, I agree. And I think people are, because we're talking about it much more now, there's, you know, more education than there has been in the past to change that.
And that's why, you know, what you're doing with the grief series and what other people in this space are doing by, you know, having these conversations and creating these resources is so important, particularly at a time where death and grief is very much at the forefront of like the collective psyche because of the pandemic.
Yeah, totally.
Mm.
Lotte, I was curious, you know, how you feel changed by Ben's death, and have you seen any gifts in the circumstance yet? And what's happened?
I think partner loss is very unique in that there are very few people in your life that are so inextricably woven into your moment to moment, day to day experience. Ben and I were living together. We'd spent the past 7 years together. I grew up with Ben. Those are my formative years from my early 20s. And we were planning a future together. So when Ben died, along went all of that. His death touched every last facet of my life. So I almost felt as though I had died a death of sorts myself. And I was then thrust into this rebirth, you know, this unwilling rebirth where I had to reinvent the wheel, to reimagine my life from scratch again. So in that sense, it's changed absolutely everything. Mm-hmm. And I also think, you know, in terms of me as a person, it absolutely has. And I couldn't have said this early on, and I would have hated anybody that told me, you know, there's gifts to be found in an experience like this. But the truth is, Tara, there are gifts. I think it has taught me just how precious and fleeting life is. And I think that's something that we can intellectualize. You know, we understand that we're here for a finite amount of time. Anything could happen at any point to any of us. We don't know what the future holds. But when you live through that experience, what it's done for me is it's forced me to live with a great sense of urgency and a sense of immediacy. Mm-hmm. And I also feel just so incredibly grateful to be alive. You know, the little things don't faze me anymore. And I like to think, at least, that I don't take anything for granted. Every single day is a gift, and it's a gift that those we've lost would cherish. And so leading on from that, that's one of the ways in which I feel we can honor our loved ones the most, you know, by reaching for joy, by finding things to feel grateful for, by living in their honor, you know?
Yeah, 100%. That's so beautifully put. Thank you, Lotte.
You're welcome. And it's hard to get there, you know, it's taken me a long time to reach that point where I can genuinely feel gratitude, and I can feel joy, and I can reach for fun without the feeling of pain and guilt diminishing that. But one thing I will say is that grief is an experience of duality. You know, it's not one thing or another. Just because you are having a good day and you're smiling and laughing doesn't mean that suddenly your pain is no longer there. Mm-hmm. Your pain will always be with you. It's now yours to carry. You know, this is now a part of you. It will forever be a part of you, but you are deserving of living a full and meaningful and happy life.
Yeah.
Because you're here, you know, you are alive, and that is a gift.
So wonderfully put. Really.
Thank you.
So helpful. And my final question that I like to ask people is, what would be your interpretation of the term conscious grief?
Hmm. Well, I think firstly, grief is a very sacred experience. And if we come back to that quote, grief is love with nowhere to go, it is a manifestation of your love for that person. Yeah. And whilst it can be the most brutal, painful, traumatic experience, it can also be something incredibly transformative and beautiful. And that, I think, is what conscious grief means to me. It's like, how can we take all of that love that we feel for the loved one that we've lost, at least in the physical sense, how can we transmute it? How can we carry it in a way that enriches our lives? Mm-hmm. You know, that helps us to find meaning and purpose again as we move forwards without them in this realm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that was a good answer.
I think that's beautifully said. Thank you. And I also made me think about, like you say, how am I going to transmute this experience? And I know that, as we've talked about, you've been doing that through your writing on Instagram, but you've also created something called What Now Grief. So do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yes, it's Now What Grief. So Now What.
That's my dyslexia. I've written that wrong.
Don't worry. So the Now What, a guide to navigating life after loss grief workbook, was launched mid-December, and it's a culmination of 18 months of soul searching and all of the lessons that my dear friend Elodie and I have learned since losing our partners from July 2020. And we wrote this in the hope that it provides comfort and support to people navigating all types of loss. So it's not just relevant to partner loss. We call it a workbook because it's interactive in the sense that there are a number of different journal prompts throughout. There are worksheets, and there are also downloadable meditations. For me, I found writing to be an incredibly cathartic outlet. I think we all need that. As I said earlier in this conversation, you know, there are some things that just cannot be integrated or moved through, you know, in the traditional sense, speaking to a therapist or a counselor, for instance. For me, writing was very, very helpful. And it's actually rather wonderful looking back over my journals and seeing how far I've come. Mm-hmm. And so we encourage our readers to reflect upon their own experience, because it is sacred, mm-hmm. you know, and this is a way of making your grief, your experience of grief, conscious and intentional. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to put a link to that underneath this interview so that people can go to it and buy it. It's a great value for money, and it's, yeah, a really welcoming, amazing companion to have in your grief. And I totally relate to you with journaling. I think I didn't realize from a young age, you know, writing in my diary was a very therapeutic thing.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, we all need that, whether it's writing or running or painting or just something that allows us to, you know, express our emotions.
Yeah, creativity.
Absolutely.
Really brings hope. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And is there anything else you would like to share before we wrap up?
I just want to send all my love and solidarity to your listeners, to the people tuning into this series. Tara, it's been just such a joy and a privilege to have connected with you and to be getting to know you. I think you're doing amazing, amazing things. And, you know, the more we talk about it, the more we normalize this very normal human experience that is an inevitability for all of us at one point, if we haven't already experienced it in our lives. And it's just so important to have these conversations. So thank you for the work that you're doing and for inviting me to have this conversation with you. I hope it helps your listeners in some way.
It will be invaluable, and I've got chills all over me, and I just listen to you, Lotte, and I don't know, you're a very, very powerful woman, and I'm excited for all the things that you're going to produce in the future, and all the help that you're going to give to people. So yeah.
Thank you. Well, you know, on that note, I think transmuting the experiencing and finding a way to establish a sense of meaning and purpose for your life moving forwards is of utmost importance when navigating, you know, such big loss, and something I would encourage everyone to do. And that's a way of carrying their legacy forwards. And it doesn't mean coming and speaking about grief, or, you know, that might not be something that resonates with you, but it might be making a small donation to a cause that your loved one cared about, or, you know, taking up a hobby that they enjoyed, or just integrating their values, you know, in your life. And as you move forwards, these are all ways in which we can, you know, integrate our grief and begin the healing process, I think. And by healing, we mean integration, of course, not reaching a point where we clap our hands and we say we're done grieving, but, you know, integrating our loss, finding a way to live alongside it.
Yeah, quite right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, thank you
so much. You're very welcome.
To everybody who's been listening as well.
Thank you.